Okay, let's dive right into this and explore how our most widely accepted historical facts are, well, actually fascinating illusions. When we really start to peel back the layers, we find that our shared history is often carefully crafted by mistranslations, propaganda, and pop culture. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to reconstruct the truth, layer by layer, and uncover the real stories behind the myths. Rather than just listing off random trivia, we're going to look at the exact mechanisms of myth to understand why we get history so wrong. Today, we're unpacking four key areas. First, lost in translation. Second, the power of propaganda. Third, Hollywood and pop culture. And finally, rethinking our past. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Lost in Translation. We're looking at how simple misunderstandings can completely rewrite reality. It's honestly amazing how a basic language barrier or a foreign system can completely distort the historical record for generations. For example, did Albert Einstein fail math? You've likely been taught this comforting myth, right? Especially when staring at a bad report card. I mean, it makes us all feel a little better to think a world-changing genius struggled in school just like the rest of us. But the truth? It's entirely lost in translation. This brilliantly illustrates our point, because the reality comes down to a simple numerical mix-up. See, in the Swiss grading system, where Einstein went to school, a 6 was the highest possible score, not the lowest. So when people in other European countries looked at his absolute top marks of a 6, they completely misunderstood the scale. They thought his stellar grades looked like catastrophic failures. Now, he did fail his very first entrance exam to the Zurich Polytechnic, but that was due to weak scores in languages, history, and biology, never math or physics.
The guy was a sheer prodigy. By the time he was 15, he had completely mastered complex differential and integral calculus. So that whole math failure story? Just a numerical mistranslation that spiraled totally out of control.
And we see this happen again with a classic architectural myth, the vomitorium. The common myth paints this picture of a special, decadent room in Roman villas where wealthy elites would purge themselves during banquets just so they could eat more. But later writers completely misinterpreted the Latin term vomere, which simply means to spew forth. It wasn't a gross room for purging at all. It was a brilliant architectural exit, a passageway in amphitheaters designed to efficiently spew forth or empty large crowds. The Colosseum could actually empty 50,000 spectators in just 15 minutes through these vomitoriums. So we've seen how simple errors rewrite reality. Let's shift gears to Section 2, the power of propaganda. History is written by the victors, sure, but also by the satirists. Let's see what happens when the distortion is absolutely intentional. Let's talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. Was he actually short? When we think of the French emperor, we immediately picture a tiny, angry man. We even have the infamous Napoleon complex named after him. But this entire psychological concept is built on a deliberate historical smear campaign. Here's the catch. His officially recorded height used the old French inch system. And a French inch was actually longer than a British inch. When poorly converted, it made him look much smaller on paper. But British propagandists knew exactly what they were doing. Satirical cartoons by the artist James Gillray intentionally exaggerated this minor confusion to mock Napoleon as a tiny, petulant child. And wow, did that false image stick.
In reality, Napoleon stood around 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall, which was perfectly average, maybe even above average for his era. But he also strategically surrounded himself with his towering imperial guards. Standing next to those massive soldiers really helped lock that visual illusion of the tiny emperor into history.
Speaking of propaganda, let's look at a much darker example, the true triggers of World War I. For over a century, textbooks have heavily blamed Germany alone for the outbreak of the war. But the reality was a reckless, continent-wide system of entangled alliances and secret treaties. France actively funded Russian mobilization to seek revenge. Russia ordered mobilization first, knowing full well it meant war. And Serbia's Black Hand orchestrated the assassination that lit the match. Pinning the sole blame on Kaiser Wilhelm was a deliberate Allied narrative crafted to justify the punishing Treaty of Versailles, completely papering over the complex global machinery that actually caused the slaughter.
This brings us to Section 3, Hollywood and pop culture, embellishing the past for dramatic effect. Let's explore how the entertainment industry, from 1800s operas to modern blockbusters, creates visually striking but completely fabricated histories.
Take the Vikings. We've all pictured it, right? Massive warriors, storming beaches, and terrifying horned helmets.
But authentic Viking gear, like the famous Geirmund Boo helmet, never had horns. That myth was entirely invented centuries later by 1800s opera costume designers who just wanted some dramatic, theatrical flair on stage.
From a practical standpoint, having horns in battle would be a terrible, fatal idea. They would have given enemies a perfect handle to grab onto in hand-to-hand combat, and they would have constantly snagged on tree branches during raids. Now, archaeologists have found horned helmets, but they were actually 3,000-year-old ceremonial crowns from Denmark, completely unsuited for the deadly reality of a Viking raid.
Or take another legendary image created by ancient storytellers, the Trojan horse. Notice the massive gap on this timeline. Archaeology confirms the city of Troy burned down around 1200 BC, but Homer and Virgil didn't write the epics detailing the giant wooden horse until 4 to 8 centuries later. History is a slow process, and absolutely no physical evidence of the Trojan horse exists. The tale was likely a clever metaphor for siege weapons, covered in horse hides, or ships that were referred to as seahorses, or maybe even a massive earthquake that breached the city walls.
And what about the pyramids? Hollywood films and the ancient Greek historian Herodotus pushed this narrative that they were built by enslaved people suffering under the whip, but the reality is quite the opposite. Modern excavations have revealed a massive workers' village right near the pyramids, complete with dormitories, bakeries, and even a hospital. The builders' tombs show they were buried with immense honor, and studies of their remains show they ate a diet rich in meat. These were paid, highly skilled professionals and seasonal farmers, not slaves.
Which brings us perfectly to our final section, Section 4, Rethinking Our Past, How Modern Science Corrects Ancient Records. We are entering an amazing era where scientific modeling, data analysis, and modern archaeology are finally correcting these deeply ingrained misconceptions.
Look at the Black Death. For centuries, the narrative has been that rats spread the plague that killed a third of Europe in the 14th century. But recent computer modeling from the University of Oslo compared transmission vectors to match historical death rates. In the rat-based model, a surprisingly poor match. The strong match was human fleas and lice. The deadly culprit was actually human-to-human transmission via our own parasites, basically exonerating the rats we've been blaming for hundreds of years.
Here's another massive misconception. Did people in the Middle Ages really only live to be 30? It's this incredibly pervasive belief that our ancestors simply dropped dead as soon as they hit their 30s. But this is just a fundamental misunderstanding of how statistical averages work.
The reality is that the average life expectancy metric is heavily distorted by tragic rates of infant and child mortality. Yes, the average life expectancy at birth was mathematically around 30 to 35, but skeletal evidence proves that this doesn't mean you aged rapidly and died at 30. If you survived the immense dangers of infancy, early childhood, and childbirth, you routinely lived well into your 50s or 60s. Adults in the Middle Ages lived remarkably long lives. The math is just skewed by early deaths.
We started this explainer with Albert Einstein, and as he himself once clarified, I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus. Ultimately, history is deeply malleable. It's constructed layer by layer, and sometimes those layers are built entirely on fiction. So I'll leave you with this final thought. If our shared past is this heavily built on mistranslations, statistical errors, and intentional propaganda, what do you currently accept as absolute truth in your life right now that simply isn't?